My friends, it's time to have a blunt conversation about a metaphorical elephant in American politics. Few have been willing to wade into this sensitive topic out of fear of being labeled anti-Semitic. But our nation's complicated relationship with Israel demands both serious discussion and objective scrutiny. While Israel is often described as an important and strategic ally of the United States, these claims have gone without any contemporary and objective assessments. Such evaluations, where they do exist, suggest that while Israel was once a strategic asset, it has now become an increasing liability. Credible experts have even alleged that Israel has become an ally in pretense only. And while Israel continues to enjoy lucrative benefits from their relationship with the United States, these benefits not only go unreciprocated, but in fact they come with substantial liabilities that harm our economy, endanger consumers, jeopardize our national security, impede our foreign policy agenda, and corrupt our political system. Interestingly, when it comes to foreign powers, say Russia, penetrating the veil of our political system, Americans from all ideological persuasions are rightfully outraged. And yet, the same does not appear to apply when it comes to the corrupting and sometimes malicious influence of an apartheid state such as Israel, which is desperately pouring millions of dollars into our political campaigns, largely to the benefit of right-wing candidates. I want to take a quick moment to look at the past and recent activities of one pro-Israel lobbying group. The American Israel Public Relations Committee, also known as AIPAC, shares a unique and particular distinction with the National Rifle Association as being among the most dangerous and corrupting influences on the American political system. Both of these self-described lobbying groups engage in what some call anti-democratic and often legally questionable tactics to advance their agenda. And both, again, sometimes engage in nefarious activities that include what, again, some might call bribery and outright intimidation tactics to influence public policy and bully politicians. Both exploit the political process and thrive on the fears and perceived vulnerabilities of their constituents, fears and vulnerabilities they often themselves cultivate. The breadth of influence and power that these two organizations wield is virtually unprecedented, and neither really serves the interest of the American people. The acts of these organizations endanger lives, pose threats to our national security, and perpetuate a global climate of incessant violence, upon which both depend upon for their survival. Now, according to the Federal Election Commission, AIPAC is a, quote, membership organization, end quote, rather than a political action committee, a distinction that has long been challenged by previous administrations, which have attempted to force the group to register as a foreign agent due to the organization's long history of abuse and criminality. While AIPAC, at least officially, has refrained from directly contributing to election campaigns, suddenly in 2022, they have launched two deceptively innocuously named groups and have been coordinating with other pro-Israel PACs to pour close to $30 million into primary campaigns aimed at defeating progressive candidates and anyone who has dared to speak up for the plight of the Palestinians, or even otherwise criticize Israel's policies. AIPAC's United Democracy Project has even endorsed, and some say contributed funds, to 109 Republicans who have propagated the lie about the stolen election and are widely seen as enabling the January 6 insurrectionists. The United Democracy Project spent a total of just over $6 million to prevent former four-term Congresswoman Donna Edwards from returning to Congress in Maryland's 4th Congressional District. Edwards was endorsed by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who herself condemned AIPAC for running intentionally misleading ads and vile attacks against Edwards. The pro-Israel lobbying group has further endorsed a slate of candidates with spotty records on abortion and gun rights. This at a time when reproductive rights and mass shootings have become quite contentious issues in the election. The group spent an additional $2 million to help a conservative Democrat, Henry Cuellar, defeat his progressive challenger, Jessica Cisneros, despite the fact that Cuellar is anti-choice, and is currently the subject of an FBI criminal investigation. Over $3 million has been spent to defeat Andy Levin, a progressive Jewish American who is a staunch supporter of a two-state solution and has spoken passionately about his personal ties to Israel and his commitment to securing its long-term future. However, Levin stoked the ire of AIPAC by speaking out against the creeping annexation of the West Bank and the occupation of the Palestinians. For AIPAC, no criticisms or pushback against Israeli policies is ever acceptable. And by spending these exorbitant funds, AIPAC is once again flexing its political muscle and sending an intimidating message to other politicians that anyone who dares to challenge Israel's status quo could be next on the firing lines. To be clear, AIPAC has itself been the target of multiple investigations by a slew of federal law enforcement agencies for crimes that include espionage, violation of campaign finance laws, and corruption. Few of these investigations, however, have led to any substantial outcomes, in part because of the group's powerful allies in Washington, which has been more than willing to allow the organization to act with near blanket immunity, regardless of the many laws they break. AIPAC, in many cases, quite literally controls the purse strings of election campaigns for politicians of all political persuasions, and the organization is prone to lob charges of anti-Semitism against anyone who dares to so much as criticize them. And when these efforts fail to adequately intimidate perceived adversaries, the group resorts to other threats to escape scrutiny and accountability. Accusations of espionage activities that they date back to the organization's founding, and they include verifiable instances of theft of U.S. military technology, which Israel has then sold to America's enemies, putting American troops in grave danger on the battlefield and threatening our national security. For these audacious crimes against the United States, both Israel and its domestic lobbying groups have been given mere slaps on the wrist if they've been held accountable at all. And without doubt, this monologue itself will be considered by Zionist supporters to be no more than an outpouring of anti-Semitism. But this accusation is nothing more than a cheap shot to discredit and dissuade actual criticism. And while it is prescient to acknowledge the long and loathsome realities of anti-Semitism and its many centuries of bizarre and meritless conspiracy theories about secret cabals and the sinister influence of Jewish money, we must also be objective in our criticisms of Israel, especially when it comes to its aggressive lobbying arm here in the United States. Such criticisms, no matter how honest and objective, have often been responded to with equally unqualified accusations of anti-Semitism, a charge that has been all too successful in silencing critics, effectively granting a form of blanket immunity to Israel and the pro-Israel lobbying groups when they run afoul of the law. Real anti-Semitism does exist, and it is crucial that we combat and denounce it. But this becomes increasingly difficult when claims of anti-Semitism are used as political weapons aimed at silencing honest discourse about the role and influence that both Israel and its lobbying groups play in the U.S. foreign policy. Yet, another threat to American security is found in the tense relationship between Israel and Iran. Now, no matter how you might feel about Iran, and regardless of whatever threats Iran might pose, Iran's nuclear ambitions should cause us all an immense degree of trepidation, especially when it comes to needlessly escalating tensions with Tehran. This is particularly true when it comes to preserving the Iran nuclear deal, also known as JPOC, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was negotiated under the Obama administration, and by all accounts was proving effective until President Trump pulled out of the deal. Israel however, has no interest in diplomatic solutions with regard to Iran, and they are threatening to pull the United States into yet another war in the Middle East. The former Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, along with his predecessors, have proven relentless in consistently provoking a campaign of unending and unqualified hostility toward Iran that aims to keep it forever ostracized, sanctioned, and loathed. This demonization of Iran helps ensure that all the blame for the destabilization of the Middle East falls entirely upon Iran, obfuscating the destructive and malign behavior of Israel, which is equally complicit, if not more so, in the destabilization of the Middle East. Israel's brutal occupation of Palestinians, its aggressive military actions, acts of international terrorism, sabotage, and other clandestine operations are all unqualified threats that just agitate tensions and incite violence across the Middle East. And while it's true that Iran's use of violent proxies and its own aggressive military actions throughout the Middle East, particularly those targeting Israel, do in fact pose a unique threat to Israel's security, what is often left unsaid is that Iran's activities are largely a response to Israel's own behavior. Israel's subjugation of the Palestinians, for instance, has long been a prime motivator for extremism and terrorism against the Jewish state. So where does this get us? Well, the grim reality, which I think we must acknowledge, is that the Israeli government is not only actively working to subvert America's democratic processes, but it is also undermining U.S. foreign policy objectives, and all at the expense of U.S. taxpayers and America's own national security. There's much more to be said about the actions of AIPAC, including examples of the group's espionage operations and the cost to American taxpayers for our country's continued support of Israel. But I'm going to save these topics for another episode so that we can move forward and begin an interesting conversation with today's guest, Toufic Sarieddine, an Iranian Ph.D. student who will talk to us about China. Look, don't worry, we're going to work our way back around to Israel eventually and make the monologue a bit more relevant. The following interview is pre-recorded over the course of two separate interviews. Our first interview was cut short when our guest's cell phone inconveniently died, but Toufic was kind enough to join us again this morning to pick up where we left off, and was even gracious enough to grant me some extra time to discuss a few other issues that have creeped up since we last spoke. I hope you enjoyed the interview, and remember to please follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and our video channels. I will see you again next Tuesday. The interview begins right after our theme song. And welcome back. Joining us now is a Lebanese student, Ph.D. student in International Development and Cooperation, and we're going to be talking about China, Iran, Israel, and Palestine. Please welcome Toufic. Sorry.
Thank you, Sean.
No problem. I'm going to get this name. Toufic. Okay.
Toufic. Toufic.
Toufic. So, I want to thank you for joining us this morning. I know that it's evening over in your time. You're over in Japan.
Yep.
So I'm absolutely fascinated by what you're studying and by your biography. You're a PhD student for in international development and cooperation. And tell us about your specialty and kind of what your interest is in terms of China and the Belton Road Initiative.
Thank you very much. Well, my research focuses on, as you said, China's Belton Road Initiative, which is a global infrastructure mega project, the biggest the world has ever seen. I focus on the changes that it will bring to the Middle East and Pakistan, particularly pertaining to hegemony and what that means for Western hegemony, as in the United States hegemony.
And So one of the things that we hear, at least in the United States, is we sort of depict China as being this evil empire. Um, Now, I don't particularly take that perspective, but tell us about when did this the China first begin this initiative, and
Well, the initiative was formally launched in 2013, but before that, China, if you look at the investments China has done, it really skyrocketed during the 2000s, right on the heels of it becoming the number two economy in the world. But in 2013, it officially began the Belton Road Initiative, and it announced this. And since then, there's been numerous projects related to the Belton Road Initiative all over the world, but particularly in developing states.
and what is the I imagine that there's a public sort of motive that's being put forth, and probably a more subversive one. Um, from the public, as far as the public advance is concerned, it seems as though it's being portrayed as a humanitarian type effort, almost.
Not necessarily. It's more being portrayed as a South-South cooperation because China considers itself to be a developing country and it's aiding its fellow developing countries in the global South to achieve adequate infrastructure that will enable them to achieve thereafter adequate development in this century.
And it's interesting that China considers itself a developing country. They did go from this. Would you say that China is a capitalistic country? Because it's often portrayed as socialist, but there seems as though the economic shift is got a lot of capitalism that kind of has added to their.
Yes. Yeah, the strict communist countries remain Cuba and North Korea. China has since moved to free market capitalism. It still has restraints on its fiscal policies. This is why the yuan is not in higher circulation because the central banks want a tighter control on the currency of China. However, it is engaged in classical capitalistic maneuvers, investments abroad, as well as increasing imports and exports. Salaries are not the same for everyone. It's not a strictly communist nation, although it calls itself such. But yeah.
So how can we explain the sudden rise of China back, as you say, in the 2000 period, where they went from a relatively poor country to all of a sudden masses almost overnight? Um,
Hmm.
how did that kind of
Yeah.
come about?
Well, of course, there's several factors. There's internal and external factors. Internally, there were reforms made by its president during the 70s and 80s, which liberalized the market of China. Before it was tightly controlled. Plots of land were expected to produce certain yields no matter what. However, after privatization slowly be, started in China, production became different and increased and was open more to export. It became an export oriented economy, which is why you have the made in China boom. Deng Xiaoping was responsible for that, and he's greatly credited for the prosperity that China enjoys today. Of course, it continued this model of development well into the 1990s and the 2000s. And the financial crisis of 2008 is really regarded in international relations scholarship as kind of a pivotal point in U.S. hegemony and kind of a indicator to China that it should step in and take the reins.
And what is there cause for? I mean, again, we see a lot of fear mongering about China, and especially the Belt and
Hmm.
Road Initiative. Um, I would argue that the United States has been doing this imperialistic assault on the world for quite some time with similar strategies, doing infrastructure deals through the International Monetary Fund,
Fun.
which are, just these loans that are just almost mafiaistic in a sense. I mean, we've brought a lot of countries into severe debt with these loans. Is that kind of how China's doing it as well? Are they sort of imposing certain financial burdens on these countries in exchange for the infrastructure they're building?
Well, you forgot to mention the political assassinations the United States has been behind, such as in Chile,
Oh,
and installing regressionist regimes, such as in Chile and other places, such as in Egypt. Um, China is doing this primarily economically. It hasn't used military force in recent history. Of course, Tibet happened in the 40s and 50s, but in this century, it has been purely economic. Even though we hear stories about its military assertiveness in the South China Sea and towards Taiwan and sometimes towards India, its policy has been mostly economic. And yes, there have been accusations of China giving out predatory loans, as in loans that recipients cannot possibly pay back, but they take them anyway because of certain perks that are associated with corruption therein. Um, However, I do think that we can't really talk about motivations. We can only look at the footsteps that China has taken and kind of look at a trajectory it's going for. I'm not of the opinion that China is a malicious or evil entity. There's no such thing as an evil entity. Evil is not evil to itself. I think
right.
China believes that it's just conducting business, and if it's making a profit out of it through these predatory loans, then that's business. All is fair in trade, not only love and war. And there's been, it's a checkered history, really. There's been some successes. Pakistan, for example, turned from a country that imports energy to one that exports energy. However, you have states like Sri Lanka, which are now facing an economic meltdown, not because of China, but one of its ports was seized by China after it failed to repay a loan. So it's leased to China for 99 years, which I think is very unfair. But I I want to believe that China is learning from its mistakes and realizing that okay, yes, you are getting these incremental gains, but the public image for you is taking hits. So don't be so predatory.
Yeah, it because what seems odd to me is that these with these predatory loans is that you China and the United States seems to benefit in the short term, but over the long term, I mean, you're talking about a global financial meltdown, and so I don't understand the motivations to go forward with these predatory loans. I don't understand why. Um, I mean, is it all about just short term gain?
It depends who you ask. China is an infrastructure superpower. It has so what happened in 2008 with the financial crisis was that a lot of countries went into recession and they could no longer import from China the raw materials, steel, as well as rails that it's known for producing. So China was left with these stockpiles and upon stockpiles of infrastructure raw materials. And it realized that okay, we can export this, and this is especially important for developing countries. The development needs for Asia alone, the Asian continent alone, are in the trillions of dollars. And so these countries, developing countries, of which I am a part of, need these materials and need Chinese expertise and they need these loans. And China knows this. And it knows that through building ports, through building bridges, through building these sea lanes, it is benefiting these countries. And so it wants to make it wants to kind of capitalize off of the profit that they stand to gain, as any investor would really.
Right.
Except the difference is that you add here an integration into Chinese uh, production chains. So China is now importing raw material as opposed to being an exporter of it because it's building its own highly advanced exports. It's building electric cars now. We know that it's great in solar technology, green technology, 5G, 5G internet. And so, what the Belton Road Initiative, I theorize, is doing is that it's creating a hegemony in China within the U.S. hegemony itself. So it's creating like a mini Chinese sphere of influence or a bubble, if you will, because it's not only commodities that are being exchanged. China is also funding scholarships for students to go study in Beijing. It's also funding Mandarin courses abroad because there are many students in developing countries who want to capitalize on the Belt and Road Initiative, and so they want to become experts or bridges between Beijing and their respective states. And this creates a new cultural texture. You know what I mean?
Right.
For many people, for example, in Pakistan, which I recently researched heavily, people from all strands of society are learning Mandarin. At the schools in Pakistan, their curriculum is mostly based on the UK curriculum. However, on their websites, they're saying that Mandarin is the language of the future, so do study Mandarin. And this is a UK curriculum in Pakistan. And so you're looking at a strand of the population going forward, looking less to the West as the ideal, looking less to the West as where to go and how to behave, whether it relates to democracy or even the English language, and wanting to and forming a counterweight that is pro-China in the countries where they reside.
And what is the because again, you see this fear mongering in America about this. To me,
Mm-hmm.
this seems like a good thing that China is doing. I
Mm.
mean, I do you see that China kind of replacing America as the imperial empire?
No, no, I don't think so. So the school of thought that I subscribe to is called world systems theory and world systems analysis, and it holds that hegemony, or as you say, being the imperial empire, it's not just about money and money and military. There's many more things involved in what makes a country the strongest. There's also cultural influence. For example, French cultural influence in West and North Africa. They all learned French. They're all francophones. Um, Hegemony is made up of many, many things that the founder of process analysis did not even want to mention, but he had to eventually come up with a comprehensive list. Uh, but to answer your question, it is seen as undesirable that China would become very influential because it would be propagating its own values. And here we come to personal tastes in social values, in liberalism, in freedom of expression, freedom of thought, um, women's rights, the rights of minorities, because China is not particularly known to be particularly protective of its minorities. It's actually very um, communitarian and encourages compliance with what the majority are doing. Unlike the West, which is a lot more individualistic. And so, if China became the hegemon tomorrow, for example, your individualities would not be seen as a good thing. It would not be seen as edgy or anything. In fact, the more you conformed to the norm, the higher your status would be, the cooler you would be. And speaking Mandarin would be seen as the new English. Like, oh, my kids are so intelligent, they're speaking Mandarin. The next generation would be, oh, it's normal to speak Mandarin. It's now the international language. And so I think people are afraid because it's unfamiliar territory and they think that their way of living is the best way, which is arguable. If China thought the same, then it would be doing the same thing as the United States. But many people would look at the West's deficiencies and say that no, this is not a model I want to emulate, particularly developing states who have seen the dark side of Western influence vis-a-vis imperialism, as well as what they consider to be an excess of liberty in certain regards, according to them in their conservative communities.
But I mean, we're talking Eurasia and the Middle East, of course, are very, very diverse places. Would you not see sort of a melting of different cultures that would sort of challenge that current ideological hegemony?
Well, that's a very good question. In Pakistan, even though Pakistan and China could not be more different, Pakistan is very religious, very Islamic. China is quite atheist and actually clamps down on Muslims, like the Uyghurs, for example. It would seem that economic development trumps all ideological differences. And so you may have people who disagree with China ideologically, but they are getting their imports from China. Their jobs are provided by Chinese companies. They're learning Mandarin because it's profitable to do so to address growing demand by a Chinese population that has a higher purchasing power. And so I do think that if I understand your question correctly, the local melting pots would prevent or mitigate integration to China, certainly, but it would depend. I do see, for example, in Lebanon, you have many people who speak perfect fluent English, and they know about New Jersey, they know about New York, and they know about the different, states. It's very, very culturally impactful. And it's like they're born American without the citizenship. Like you're American until you go to the airport, and then you realize, oh, I'm actually not American. I see China having the same impact, but China's cultural impact is really its weak point. Whereas it exceeds in economic influence, its imports are the top in the world. It's the biggest importer in the world. Exporter in the world. And its purchasing power is increasing. It's now it's a large investing country, but culture is where it lacks the most. And this is where America has a big advantage over China, I believe.
Well, let's just say for the sake of argument that China were to make the argument, or somebody were to make the argument, that the reason why China, a capitalistic country now, is doing so much better than, for instance, the United States in that regard, that their social systems and cultures are inferior. Um, I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just wondering how that could kind of be seen. Because it is interesting that China, in adopting this capitalistic model, has certainly. I mean, whereas the United States is kind of suffering economically, we see China kind of being more prosperous. Um, do you think that the two are related? Their social systems in comparison to their economic?
What a great question. First of all, I just want to clarify China is not as prosperous as it seems. There's a huge disparity between the east of the country and the west of the country. In fact, the Belton Road Initiative is seen as an extension of a internal policy to develop the west of China because it is in need of investment, in need of massive investment. China recently grew out of extreme poverty. It lifted 300 million people out of poverty very, very recently. So I don't think its prosperity is comparable to the United States. Yes, it's the number two economy, but it's only been the number two economy for about 20 years, whereas Japan was the number two economy before that for far longer. Um, and China's overall GDP is lower than that of the US, and its GDP per capita is much lower than that of the US and Japan and Germany. So if you take the country as a whole, it really is not that prosperous. However, it's developing rapidly, so it does give the idea of prosperity compared to the United States, which has inflation and things like that at the moment. And
Right.
when it comes to social systems, I think China's very like the planning bodies of China's sociological architects, I call them. They envision a society where people do not uh, waste their efforts in anything that is not conducive to the state and to strengthening the state. And they find that dissent, for example, is a waste of energy and not contributing to the overall wealth of the state. They think that their plan is the correct optimal plan, and they will reach prosperity through this plan and only this plan. And they do not like dissent. They tolerate it to a degree, but if it gets out of hand, they clamp down on it. In fact, on the note of China's prosperity, there is a huge debt crisis in China as we speak. Over 80 banks are being boycotted because people are boycotting their mortgage loans because of a huge crash in the real estate market, in the housing and construction market in China. So it's not a particularly smooth path to prosperity that people may be worried about. China still has a long way to go, but it definitely has the tools and the export base to become a force to be reckoned with. In addition to nuclear capacities, it's not some country that one can invade to just get rid of. It's here, it's staying, and hopefully there can be some kind of clear demarcation of what it can and cannot do if if its actions are seen as impalatable in the countries where it is exerting a stronger influence.
Now, there's a lot of, again, rhetoric coming out of not as much since President Biden took office, but even with his administration, there is a sort of hinting of possible military hostilities against China. Um,
Hmm.
there's conflict in the Red Sea. The United States obviously sees China as a threat in terms of its again its influence and economic reach. Uh, then you've got what's going
You
on in
mean the South
Ukraine,
China Sea?
the South China Sea. Yes, sorry. Yes. Do you? There's also Hong Kong. Um, it, it seems as though we're on, especially when it comes to nuclear nations.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, China and Russia are sort of shaking hands with Ukraine to some extent. Um,
Hmm.
it, it just seems as though everything is. I mean, you've got Iran that they've
Uh-huh.
ramped up their nuclear facilities. Um, then you've got North Korea. Where do you see this kind of? Where would you expect a conflict, if there is one, to arise from? Is it going to be with Russia and Ukraine, or is it going to be with China and the United States?
There's all that. Well, it's happening all over the place. The trade war between Trump and China. The trade war that Trump started with China is arguably uh, more destructive than the mere destruction of property and the killing of personnel, because that really damages a country's revenue stream. What are people at the end of the day for states? What are people for states except producers of wealth, certain wealth, certain amounts of wealth? I know that it seems that there's like an evil axis arising: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. These countries are I mean, they would not get along with each other if America was not there. But because America's there, they have someone to unite against. Think about it. They're very different countries. Iran is a theocracy. China is atheist. Russia is Christian, and it clamps down on its Muslims. It will clamp down on them in Chechnya. North Korea is, a sham of a state that that would not even exist also if it wasn't for hatred towards America, because it's a bastard child of the Cold War.
Right.
Um, so these countries, they play together well for a while. Let me give you an example. In Syria, we know that Russia's involved in Syria, so is Iran. They actually compete for influence in Syria. They haven't really made a deal yet of who gets what. In the western ports of Syria, of Latakia and Tartus, for example, Russia has control of one of them. It wants control of the other, but so does Iran. They're both butting in. They're not best buddies. It's still very much brute force, or not brute force, but like, hey, I spent X amount of resources. I think I deserve this. Um, I, I think any alliance between them is flimsy and temporary at best, simply because of the ideological differences. However, economically, they complement each other quite well, because China is the number one importer of crude oil. And the next biggest energy source in the world is not going to be crude, it's going to be natural gas. It's going to be LNG, liquefied natural gas. The largest reserves of liquefied natural gas are in Qatar and Iran. Iran already has dumped the dollar, so its currency is no longer pegged to the dollar, and it trades its oil with China in the Chinese currency, in the yuan. Russia now is decoupling from Europe. I think it's a stupid move. I think it's premature. I think Putin is a lot more impressionable and has less restraints on him than Xi Jinping. The Chinese Communist Party, I think, has a lot more restraints on their leadership and on what the country will do than Russia. I think Russia's like a one man game. Like, it's just Putin's country. But China is a lot more systematic, a lot more pragmatic. I do not think that it will engage militarily with the United States, because if it wanted to do so, it could have attacked way, way, way before Taiwan bought sophisticated weapons from the United States. When it comes to the South China Sea, I think it's being unreasonable in that it wants the entire South China Sea for itself, as opposed to the countries that are around it, such as Vietnam and Philippines and so on and so forth. It's being a bully there, but China and Russia capitalize on the sins of the West, on the precedents of the West. They say, okay, well, we're doing it now. but you did it before. Why can't I do it when you did it before? The United States, um, well, Spain invaded the Philippines. The Netherlands invaded Indonesia. So why can't China make islands in the South China Sea? Why does you know what I mean? So that's the
Right.
frustration that it has. It's a late gamer to this imperialism thing. But concerning military threat to the states, it's established that the United States is the military hegemon of the world. So China would be very unwise to engage in that way against the United States, especially under a Republican president. I'm not sure if a Democrat president would let it slide or do things diplomatically, but a Republican president, it's expected by his or her base to react with force if force arises. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying this is the physics of the situation as I see it.
But
So for me, yes,
well, as you say, but it does seem as though that the United States has. I mean, earlier you talked about the assassinations that we carry out. There's the coups. There's the proxy coups. I mean, there's. uh, it seems as though we have meddled in so many parts. I mean, Iran, for instance, at one point had a
Shah,
democracy for the most part,
yeah, well,
and now when you and it does. Oh, I don't want to say that it always comes down to oil or energy, but again, when you look at the motives for even with Donald Trump ending the nuclear deal with Iran, um, it seems as though we're kind of itching for a conflict, whether it's in Iran to get the oil or whether it's with China, because and in a sense, some of the sanctions that we've imposed upon these countries is an act of war in itself, because as you mentioned, economically, they're extraordinarily destructive. So go ahead.
Well, I would say that what is the impetus for these actions? Iran. I'm not a fan of Iran, and we can have a big discussion on Iran. Uh, the United States did this to Iran because it saw Iran as a threat to Israel. Whether it's right to do this or not, I think it's wrong to do it. But I've also seen the effects of an Iran that has like let loose on the Middle East. I see its effect as damaging to Yemen, to Iraq, to Syria, to Lebanon as well. Um, so I'm not one of the people who think that any imperialistic effort by the United States is evil in and of itself. Because if you don't have the United States, then Russia will come in, and Russian social values are much more maybe much less compatible with those of the current population who enjoy freedom of speech, or who want freedom of speech and aspire to freedom of speech and freedom of expression and other minority rights and so on and so forth. So inching for conflict may just mean brandishing your weaponry. Like, do not do this. I'm not defending the United States for its sanctions. I'm not defending Trump for pulling out of the Iran deal. And I don't think it was his decision. I think that it was studied but studied ideologically, like for certain ideological ends, namely Israel's security. I think that's the only thing that matters to him and to his administration. Um, Certainly not the United States interests, because well, that's another topic. But when it comes to U.S., well, I don't think, for example, in Chile, I think its involvement in Chile was highly unnecessary and blatantly imperialistic. But it did it because it saw that it was a communist, potentially communist, right, ripening into communism scenario. Um, and I guarantee you that Russia has been just as brutal, and China is just as brutal. But China does not exercise. This is the key difference that China loves to use. Okay, is that China practices a policy of non-intervention. There have been a lot less assassinations abroad linked to China than those to the U.S. And so this is what gives China like some trust among the developed world as a country that is more permissive of other countries' political differences, because at the end of the day, the power of supply and demand is so strong that China can rely just on those to satisfy itself. It doesn't matter who's in power. Its exports will still be really powerful, and its imports will remain as magnetic. Um, Otherwise, it would just go on a huge. It would spend billions. It would be a lot more active in promoting its ideology in places where it's invested heavily, such as in Pakistan. But that has not been the case so far.
But it does. So at one point, the United States was
Mm.
the manufacturing capital of the world,
Yes. Hmm.
and I guess the question would be if China has been able to kind of take over that mantle, why can the United States? What's preventing the United States from regaining that mantle?
Okay, so here we come to a argument that I'm seeing a lot these days called bifurcation theory. Bifurcation theory. It says that hegemony that the United States holds is going to split between economic hegemony and military hegemony. China will seize economic hegemony, but the United States will remain the military hegemony or the security guarantor or the imperialist superpower of the world. But China will become the dominant economy of the world. Um, and so I forgot the question.
Oh,
The
I was just
question.
asking why the United States couldn't necessarily regain that
Ah,
economic mantle.
there's okay. So why do hegemons rise and fall throughout history? For many reasons. One is that eventually uh, innovation. Innovation is one factor. Eventually, a state comes up with a more efficient method of extraction of resources because that's what innovation essentially is. It's the extraction of resources
Right.
from the raw materials that you have. The phone I'm speaking to you right now is just a bunch of lithium and copper and whatever. But combined in a certain way, they extract a lot more value from those very common metals. And what China has been able to do, because it served as the manufacturing base of all of cars and things like that, it managed to copy piecemeal the assembly of cars. It managed to copy piecemeal the assembly of phones, and so it can create them now and export them at a much higher quality than it used to. China has moved beyond the creation of like toys and cheap goods. It now exports something called higher value added goods more than the United States and more than Japan. Um, and also don't forget that China's closer to a lot of markets than the United States is. The United States' closest markets are Canada and Latin America, but China's right there. It's close to Japan. It's close to the rich Arab Gulf. The Belton Road Initiative's goal, one of its goals, is to streamline a path of trade to Europe, to a rich market such as Europe, which is really the biggest market you can get. China remains the U.S. number one trading partner. Also, when countries increase wages, it forces the product to become more expensive. And so, if another country can come up with a similar product that's cheaper, that product will become exported all over the place. So this maybe explains some of the cruelty or perceived cruelty that people have about raising minimum wage. I don't think that CEOs should be, overpaid and whatever. But historically, what Reuters analysis says is that one reason hegemons wane is that the revenue they get from international trade decreases. And one reason for that is that the product in question, that was like the hot new product, like the car was at one point, becomes more expensive, and so either has to be outsourced for production elsewhere, where a country can basically copy that production process, or it becomes more expensive because you have to increase the wages of people and increase their living standards, as you really should. And so
Right.
hegemony has transitioned from the Netherlands to the United Kingdom, now the United States. However, there's a consensus, not a consensus, but there's a growing strand of scholarship that says that the next chapter of hegemony will be unlike the others. It will be a split between the economic and the military aspect. This is bifurcation theory.
And what would that? You talked about. There's a lot to unpack there. You talk about the wage problem. Now, in the United
Yes.
States, wages have not increased for nearly over a decade, really.
Mm.
And we were unable to even get it done under a democratic administration. What are the wages like in China? I mean, because as you said, they did lift people out of poverty. I'm just wondering, are we seeing a low wage market over there as well?
It is relatively low wage. That's why everything's outsourced to there, and that's why people ship their factories over there. You know, Tesla has huge factories there because labor is cheap. However, it's increasing now. The cost for labor is increasing. This is related, for example, to China importing rice. China had a policy when it was much more communist to be self-sufficient in grains and not rely on any other country for grains and be like exemplary. For a communist country should run itself to be impervious to international capitalist pulls and sways. So it worked on being self-sufficient in grains. However, it realized that okay, well with this human resources devoted solely to rice, I can import these for cheaper from Thailand and Vietnam and Pakistan, and instead use those human resources towards making cars and making more profitable processes. And also the land can be used for more profitable processes. So China's imports of rice are increasing. Its
Hmm.
production of rice internally is decreasing. People are making more money there. I'm not the wages. I mean, the way I'm not really familiar with the wages in China, but it's not really comparable. It depends where you are, really. If you're in the capital, Beijing, depending on the job you have, yes, you may have a better paying job than someplace in Arkansas. However, on the whole, no, the country's wages, on average, of course, the country's wages are lower than they are in the United States. So this brings us to GDP per capita, which in China's case is low. It's or I'd say middle ground. I wouldn't say it's one of the highest in the world by far,
So
but it's increasing.
it almost seems as though then we're stuck in this cycle of low wages or lowering wages in order to be competitive. Um,
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Well, in world systems analysis, they use something called they kind of gauge how long hegemony lasts, and they put it at 40 to 60 years. Um, and it depends a lot on innovation. Innovation really is the key because if you innovate a product that's able to yield returns in trade that are high, then you can still then you can use those returns to develop to like increase your capital in the country and increase its wealth and so on and so forth and pay people higher wages. So it's really all about innovation. This is where 5G technology comes in, where microchip assembly comes in. So those are the industries that China is after. And this is what makes it particularly economically threatening to the West. Germany, for
right.
example, has decided to stop outsourcing its manufacturing to China because it's seen that China has been able to duplicate its production processes and its innovations, essentially. And you also have espionage that plays a part in this. People send spies to companies to see how they've managed to assemble these certain products and things like that. Um, so if the United States is still able to chug out really good innovations, like Facebook, for example, is a fantastic innovation. It gets all this revenue from all over the place on ads and things like that to the United States. The car was a great innovation at one point as well. The airplane was a great innovation. But China's innovations right now are very, very. Oh, excuse me.
Oh, sure.
Someone just called me. Yes, but China's innovations are making headway because it's very keen to what demand is, and that's why it's the biggest exporter of solar panels, for example, and green technology there is booming, for example. Uh, and so one has to find the right balance in order to stay afloat. And plus, the United States' biggest advantage is the US dollar being the most traded the currency in the world and really the backbone of trade in crude oil and other fuel. But it's from the research I've seen, China has beat the United States in trade and in exports in Pakistan and the United Arab Emirates. And so I'm not really sure. I'm not. It's not really my place to prescribe for the United States what it needs to do to like catch up with China. But just in terms of exports, China is like tens across the board almost, and that is the basis for gains it could make in other ways. Because if you know that, okay, this Chinese company's exports are killer. I've got to work with them. Oh, I'm gonna learn Mandarin. Oh, I'm gonna find out where to go in China to like seek out the best people to employ and try to get the products from point A to point B. It makes you engaged with the country, and so from that you get some culture of it from it. And so these are all related things, economy, culture, military, so on and so forth. This is why it was hard for world systems pioneer Emmanuel Wallerstein to like comprehensively, make a list. He was vehemently against this, but you see how it's all related.
Well, you mentioned the U.S. dollar, and it, especially with what's going on in Ukraine, there's been a few countries, I believe China's one of them, that has wanted to escape the U.S. dollar. They wanted to get away from the SWIFT system. They wanted to, and some countries in the Middle East. I know that, like I said, Russia now is working, and they're sort of working to undermine the U.S. dollar and sort of, especially as
Sorry,
it
Sean, you
turns.
cut off. Let me just put in my earphones really quick.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
Because I can't really hear you. Sorry. I think after my friend called, the audio settings were affected.
Changed.
Yes, you were saying?
Oh, I was saying so. You were mentioning the U.S. dollar, and we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing major efforts and advances in many countries. Some in the Middle East, certainly China is involved, and Russia, where there's a new level of cooperation to get away from the SWIFT system, for instance, and to
Mm-hmm.
even change and challenge the petrodollar. Um,
Yes.
if that were to happen, um, that puts the United States in a very precarious position. I mean
Yes.
that changes, and that would, in theory, possibly change our military uh, influence as well, would it not? If there, I mean, because if we were economically disadvantaged,
Mm-hmm.
that would certainly affect our ability to fund these escapades throughout the world.
That's a very good point. Well, let me start with the petrodollar, petro-yuan. The petrodollar status is actually contested. Some people don't think it's as hyped up as it is, and some people think that it's invincible. Uh, but what's happened recently is that China's managed to secure futures contracts for crude from the Middle East in the yuan. And this is something that Goldman Sachs described as indirectly promoting the internationalization of the yuan. If the Arab world, or basically the oil producing countries, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which are Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, the UAE, and Kuwait, if they decide to shift to the yuan, they would make the most traded commodity in the world only traded with the yuan, and this would leave countries abroad with a lot of yuan that they would then inevitably use for other international trade. However, China itself is an obstacle to this because, as I said previously, it's not that free market capitalism. The state still exercises control over the currency. China doesn't want to lose control of how much yuan it has to print out because then it cannot set the rate the way it wants to. Then it doesn't have as much control as it did before. Um, so it's a difficult thing for it, but certainly China does have proponents. Like Russia is very much for the end of the petrodollar. So is Angola, which is in the
Right.
southwest Africa. It's also against the petrodollar, and certainly yes, decreasing revenue from that. Uh, well, remember, it's all currency that's traded. It's not like going directly into the United States. The United States doesn't get money every time oil is traded. It's just there's a lot of dollars floating around. So I think that I think that U.S. revenue for the military will remain largely unchanged because again, it's not like the U.S. is uh, becoming richer as oil is being traded. No, it's just that it's traded in the United States dollar, so it has to print more for these transactions to happen.
Right.
Um, yeah, in terms of military escapades, I think that the recent events in the UAE, when after the Houthi attacks, the United States jumped to the rescue of Dubai. and it reaffirmed its commitment to security therein. And the U.S. has a very established presence in the Middle East. I don't think, yes, it did pull out of Afghanistan prematurely, but recently China tried to build a military base in the UAE. And when Washington found out, it obstructed and vetoed it. And the UAE immediately scrapped the deal and denied the deal. So China is not actually known for being a reliable security guarantor. There's some people who say that, okay, well, China's on good terms with Iran. Maybe if it's on good terms with Iran, it could convince Iran to convince the Houthis not to attack Saudi Arabia and the UAE. However, what we see on the ground is that China does not have absolute influence on Iran yet, and Iran does not have absolute influence on the Houthis either. It's a very yes, they're a militia that gets their instructions from Iran, but sometimes they act of their own accord. So it's very unreliable for the GCC to switch allegiances like that at the moment, and all their currencies are pegged to the US dollar except for Kuwait. And actually, when the Fed raised its Federal Reserve rate, so did the banks of the GCC, to show you how dependent they are on the dollar. They all did that except for Oman.
You mentioned some Afghanistan, the premature pullout. This is just another example of how the United States gets involved in these conflicts without any real goals or objectives. I mean, no one really knew what the military objectives were in Afghanistan, going on all of these years. How is I mean, we've already seen horror scenes happening in Afghanistan with people trying to flee that country. The threat of women's rights being rolled back are very real as the Taliban regains its influence. How is all of this going to sort of affect things as well? Do you see China making headroads into Afghanistan?
Definitely, yes, I do see it doing so. China doesn't care about cruelty or human rights. It doesn't. I just want to say that first, for us in the Middle East, we see that the U.S. also doesn't care because
Yeah.
Israel can get away with doing whatever it wants. We see Zionists taking people's houses, and the U.S. just says, "Oh, you shouldn't do that," but that's it. And so, China, if anyone criticizes China on becoming best buddies with the Taliban, it'll just say Israel, and that will refute the critique. Which is why I think that the U.S. should seriously reconsider its policy towards Israel, and Israel should behave itself and be courteous to its neighbors. Anyway, about China and Afghanistan, yes, certainly Afghanistan has raw material. It has a lot of lithium. Lithium is what you need for solar energy, for electric car batteries. In fact, China sent a delegation to the Taliban. It hasn't publicly recognized it yet because here's the interesting part. Uh, because it needs to export to Europe, which has the most money to spend on Chinese imports, it has to make sure that these are ethical because of the threat of boycott. There was a threat of boycott of goods produced by Uyghurs, for example. And I mean, China cares about the bottom line a lot. So if it perceives that any electric cars created with Taliban lithium will not be purchased by Europe, it's not worth it for them to normalize relations right now with the Taliban, even though the Taliban are practically begging for investment by China because they know, and we all know, that China doesn't care about human rights. It cares about the bottom line. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing I'm just saying that this is the consensus on the issue. Um, China hasn't taken any refugees from anywhere. The Rohingyas right there, but China hasn't taken any refugees. So, and even though it's vast and it could easily accommodate them, it hasn't done so. The West has. The West does have the humanity factor, and it has the funds to enforce them to a degree. If it sticks, but this depends on it sticking to its principles under all circumstances and not making exceptions for states like Israel or for U.S. Attacks on other countries. Like it's a matter of upholding principles because that's what wins it. I'm gonna say credibility points on the international stage.
Absolutely. You know, I want to talk about Israel for just a moment. Can you? I'm going to start off with a simple yet complex question. A lot of people in the United States, a lot of the absolutist defenders of Israel, say, well, this conflict between Israel and Palestine, that's not Israel's fault. Palestine started that. Um, these ridiculous arguments, right? Could you kind of just give us a history of where that conflict kind of started? And by the way, I agree. I think the way that the Israelis are, I mean, again, talk about a nation that does foreign assassinations. I
Uh-huh.
mean, Israel. I would say
Is it
that
foreign
there's,
really? Because some people think that all that land is Israeli, so it's not foreign to them.
well, yes, that's true. Yeah, I think the most high profile assassination that's for a while it was the general in Iran, the nuclear
Ah, yes.
yes. Which again, it just seems to me it's like you're starting to see why countries maybe not like Iran are not all that friendly. Um,
Oh, well, I
you
think
know,
that Iran had it coming. I think I completely support the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. I because I'm Lebanese, I've seen the results of Iranian influence in Lebanon, and I don't like it. I understand why it exists. It exists as a counter to Israel. You have to understand that any misbehavior you see on Iran's part is seen as a response to Israel, and whatever damage it does as a result of its response is seen as a better alternative than what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. But when it comes to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, I think that he's been at it for a long time, and he left himself quite vulnerable just in the airport of all places. And Trump was there, and he was like fiending for some heroic legacy. And so may he rest in peace is all I can say. But I'm not a fan of his.
right? But I mean, the assassinations
Mm.
is sort of where again you sort of start to lose credibility as a country. Again, the United States is probably the purveyor of assassinations in that regard. Um, but going
Well,
back to
if I
Israel and
may, Iran is has been deemed, well, not deemed, but Hezbollah, which is an Iran-backed militia in Lebanon, has recently been proven to have assassinated our prime minister in 2006, Rafi al-Hariri. And so it's not innocent. And some people would say that it deserved this. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that this is what some
right.
people would say.
Well, and this is
Yeah,
kind of the
so
problem with these war games and these
yeah.
just attacks, like whether the drone strikes or assassinations, is that if one country, and again, the United States has a great deal of influence and in even if it's waning credibility. And when we
Mm-hmm.
engage in these tactics, when we say we care about human rights and yet we engage
Mm-hmm.
in drone strikes and assassinations and torture,
Yep. Yep.
that sends a message to other countries like, well, wait a minute, we're Iran. Why can't we do the same thing? And in
Yep.
the name of
Yeah. Yeah.
defense.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
but so can you kind of back to the original question about the origins of this conflict between Palestine and Israel?
Okay. Let's see how well I do on this. It's like the classic Arab intellectual question. Let's see how I do. So Arabs and Jews lived together in harmony for the longest time. In fact, after the Spanish Inquisition and other anti-Semitic hostilities in Europe, we took in a lot of Jews. And there's even places in the Arab world that are named after Jews. In Lebanon, you have a place called um, Wadi al-Yahud or something like that, which means the Valley of the Jews. For example, there's also synagogues, old synagogues throughout the Arab world. So, and I, for example, only learned about anti-Semitism when I learned about Hitler. So we're not taught to hate Jews, and we don't
Right.
hate Jews just as a state of nature. That is absurd. As a result of World War II with the Holocaust. So what happened? Okay, Zion, because of the injustices that Jews were facing in Europe, this person called Theodor Herzl came up with Zionism, and he said that there should be a homeland for the Jews to protect them and where they can live their Jewish lifestyle freely and without threat of violence. Then, during World War I, the Prime Minister of the UK, his name was Balfour, and he made a deal with Sir Rothschild. And this is a document that's publicly available. This is not some conspiracy talk. The deal was that he would purchase arms, he would purchase arms using money from Sir Rothschild in exchange for securing a homeland for the Jews. Balfour agreed. Part of his reasoning was not only that he needed the money against Germany, but also that he was very devoutly Christian, and he believed that Jews should go to their homeland to bring about the second coming and whatever.
Right.
And so after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was carved up. You got Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and the Protectorate of Palestine. It was the Protectorate. And then a lot of Jews started immigrating to the area. Now, this is where things get blurry, because some people say that, okay, the Jews wanted to impose their way of living on the native Muslims and Christians there, and so they were being problematic. Some people say that, and some people say, oh no, the Muslims and Christians were being hostile towards the Jews, so they were being problematic. So the origin of who was a bad neighbor, so to speak, is blurry. I'm being conservative here and saying it's blurry, because what we're taught in Middle East curriculums is that there were armed militias, and this is documented, armed Zionist militias whose goal was to create a Jewish-only state, and they terrorized the native population, they expelled them from their houses, and they wanted to create an Israeli state. In 1949 or 51, the State of Israel was declared as established. It was much smaller than it is now, and as soon as it was established, on top of what is historic Palestine, it was attacked by its Arab neighbors, and it won because of European and American assistance. And from there's been like a series of expansionism by Israel and met with wars by the Arab states, so on and so forth, until the situation you have today. Israel has, well, it's not even Israel. Some people would just call it a Zionist entity because it, in fact, has no fixed borders. And if you ask Zionists where Israel is, they'll tell you that it's between the Nile and the Euphrates. The Nile in Egypt and the Euphrates in Iraq. And some people who are Zionists genuinely believe that Jews are superior and that when the Messiah comes, the rest of us will be their slaves. And these are the people who are the backbone of Zionist settlement, which is the act of going to a Palestinian's house who has the key to this house and a contract and lease of the house, and saying, oh no, the Bible says the Torah says this is my house, so get out. This is not an argument. It's not rational. I'm disgusted by intellectuals in the West that kind of like pseudo justify this. Like Jordan Peterson is absolutely cowardice regarding this matter. Ben Shapiro is disgusting about this. He says settlements rock because Israelis are more technologically advanced and smarter, so they kind of deserve the land.
Yeah,
which is what
statement.
What it's exactly what the apologists of Native American genocide say. Like Ayn Rand, for example. Ayn Rand says that, oh well, Native Americans didn't do much with the land. Europeans did more with it, so they deserved it. It's because it's based in religion. It's sensitive and irrational at the same time. Now, what frustrates me, for example, I see the situation as apartheid South. Let me just. I'm sure your viewers are aware that right now, Israel is a very like I'm going to say amoebic, and in form. It doesn't have a fixed form, but Palestine is divided into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It's very hard to leave there. It's very hard to live there. There's been accusations of Israel trying out weapons that it wants to sell on the population there. Uh, Resistance of the population by like crude weaponry is met with sophisticated weaponry that kills civilians. There's people who say, "Oh, those civilians are near the terrorists, and the terrorists are using them as human shields." And there's others who say, "Well, why are they so mad then? Give them more liberty, give them more rights." You have settlements still going on today, illegally under international law, where a settler can go into a house backed by Israeli armed police and pull people from their house, pull them physically from their house. And if they resist, they will be gunned down because that is a citizen of Israel who's with the police who are sworn to protect him or her. So we, as the Arabs, see what's going on. We see America sticking up for this. Germany is crippled with guilt, and it still supports this implicitly, of course. It bans, or not bans, but like there's some penalty for speaking out against Israel in Germany because it seems anti-Semitic. It's not anti-Semitic. You're just taking my house. It's anti-theft. It's anti-property rights. And you know what I mean? Like, what gives? Just because you're a Jew doesn't mean you get to take my house. It's not like you get a house, you get a house, you get a house. No.
No, you
So
get the
it's
same
very
thing
that.
here with the boycott divestment.
Oh,
Boycott Israel.
yes.
It's
Yes.
anti-Semitic, and they've passed laws, essentially banning that.
I
Um,
might be cut off in a bit because my battery is on 1%. I'm charging it right now, so let's see what will occur. But yeah, go on.
um, so no, I mean, you look at just the way the Palestinians are treated. I mean, I would go
Mm,
beyond apartheid to describe. I mean, it is just absolutely atrocious. Um,
yes. To give your listeners an example, there are many, many checkpoints throughout the West Bank. The West Bank that's supposed to be under Palestinian control. There's many Israeli checkpoints to get from point A to point B. The distance is nothing, but you have to pass through so many checkpoints. There's even like highways that there's like highways that only, for example, citizens of Israel can use, and others that only Palestinians can use, and those are much less developed, have a lot more traffic in them. Well, some people would say that, oh, there's two highways because of security purposes, but it's a vicious cycle. The more you oppress the local population, the angrier they will be. So what do you do about that? What the Jordan has a peace with Israel. So does Egypt, and Israel has respected those deals thus far. Lebanon does not. It's officially at war with Israel. Um, so is this case with Syria. The despots in Lebanon and Syria use Israel as a scarecrow. They say that, okay, we're in power, no freedom of like Syria, for example, Bashar al-Assad. He is regarded as a hero by some people because he's seen as a shield against Israel, and other people regard him as using Israel as a scarecrow to get away with basically everything. So the whole Syrian civil war, bombing children, corruption, a lack of freedom of expression, all kinds of atrocities are justified because he is in the resistance. And the resistance is a common word used in Arabic, which is like forces against Israel and forces against American imperialism. Israel has been one of the biggest stains on America's reputation, and it has corroded the appeal of its liberalism in the Arab world. Some people say that, oh, you want women's rights? What are you, some Zionist or something like that? So it's just infected all the good stuff that America has because of this very historically incorrect position that it will be judged on uh, decades from now. But yes, it is apartheid, and the Abraham Accords I thought were like hopefully a step forward because several Arab countries that were hostile to Israel and did not have any trade relations with it opened up to Israel. In return, we have not seen Israel take any steps forward to us. It still allows settlers to do what they like. It still oppresses the local population in Gaza and the West Bank. It still is not doing anything towards a two-state solution. It wants to expand more and more and more until there is no other state to be the second state in the two-state solution. Um, and this ultimately goes back to racism. They just don't want the Jewish state to have non-Jews in it. And there's been scandalous cases of migrants from Africa being forcefully sterilized because they're not Jewish and they don't want them to reproduce inside the country. And there's also been cases of on Nelson Mandela's birthday or the anniversary of his death of Zionist fanatics creating ruckuses around um, African neighborhoods to kind of like, oh, what are you going to do about it, or something like that. So Zionism is extremely problematic, and I think, and the United Nations recently concluded a very hefty, extensive report that says that Israeli settlements are the root cause of conflict in the Middle East, which I believe 100%. And everything you see now can be argued to be a reaction to that.
Right. And why is the United States? I guess this is what puzzles me. Why does the United States? I mean, you mentioned earlier that we are. I would say that the United States is very intentional in its efforts. I don't think there's anything necessarily tacit about the approval. I mean, we're a lot. We send a lot of funds to Israel that we could cut off,
Yes,
weaponry.
yes,
There's a lot that we could do to say, "Hey, stop that," and yet we
yeah,
don't.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely.
why is that? I mean, what is it that Israel and the United States have that sort of allows us to just say, "Yeah, well, let them do what they."
Some people say Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. That's not true. Lebanon's a democracy too. On Lebanon's a democracy. Egypt is a democracy. Uh,
I'm sorry, folks. I think we might have lost our guest. And I want to welcome back our special guest. We lost our connection with him previously. Toufic is joining us again to finish our conversation about Israel. And I've also got a few other questions I want to ask him as well. So let's go ahead and welcome back Toufic.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you for coming back. Sorry about the technical difficulties we had last time.
No problem.
Uh, I want to ask you real quickly. I want to go back to Israel, but
Hmm.
recently Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in
Hmm.
China, and I know that China has sort of retaliated in various ways, including issues that affect Japan. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that for a moment and sort of underline maybe the consequences of this visit.
Yeah, so China made it quite clear that it does not tolerate any rhetoric or any activity that would imply a separation between Taiwan and mainland China. As a result of Pelosi's visit, China has executed, as you know, military drills around Taiwan. It's also banned a lot of Taiwanese imports, agricultural imports. And China being Taiwan's biggest trade partner, that was a kind of a blow to the Taiwanese economy. Not a big blow, because Taiwan, as you know, is a semiconductor hub of the world. It produces the most semiconductors, very nano-sized semiconductors. So it's not greatly affected by this. It's more of a, I think it's a temporary symbolic gesture that China is very, very unhappy with what has unfolded. In Japan here, we're quite concerned because were China to act recklessly, it would not only seek to return Taiwan to itself by force, but it would definitely seek to attack and damage Japan in some way because of a justified hatred it has towards Japan. Remember, Japan was not always very, cute and harmonious and well thought of as it is today. It used to be a very, very much feared imperial power that was brutal to its neighbors. And so that's something that it has to deal with as well.
Now, part of the issue with Taiwan, if I'm correct, is that during World War II, Japan actually used Taiwan to engage in attacks against China, which is presumably one of the reasons why China is so against any kind of interventions with Taiwan. Would that be accurate?
I'm not sure about Japan using Taiwan. I do know that Taiwan was part of China. China was ruled by, as you know, an imperial family. And then following World War II, there was a civil war between the ruling elite and the Chinese Communist Party. And it was a very bloody civil war. And finally, the ruling elite had to flee mainland China to Taiwan and establish rule there. They actually took with them gold, a lot of people. They took essentially the seeds of a nation with them, as well as historic artifacts of imperial China to Taiwan. The beef between the beef between China and Japan is multifaceted, but one of the main things about it is that Japan recognizes Taiwan, and it has very friendly relations with Taiwan. And it's sort of like, to the Chinese, it's sort of like Taiwan is Japan's little pet, is imperialist Japan's little good girl. That's actually Chinese. Like, you're one of us and you went and betrayed us with Japan, who was terrible to us. And now you have your own little island nation. And if it wasn't for the United States, it would have engulfed it, like an amoeba a long time ago. So that's the dynamic. That's one of the facets of the dynamic there. So people in Taiwan, although you could argue they're like ethnically Chinese or whatever that means, they're actually different from the Han Chinese. They're actually Hakka Chinese. So they're actually also, and that sub-ethnicity, there is a difference between them. And gradually, they're identifying not as Chinese. Like these days, only 3% identify as wanting to reunite with China and are against being separate states, because Taiwan is actually a democracy. It's a democratic country. It affords the citizens more civil rights, more freedom of expression, rights for minorities are a lot more respected there. And so China and Taiwan really symbolize successful Western designs for a state, as in Taiwan, and moderately successful non-Western designs for a state, as in China. And so it's a very, very symbolic, I think, fixture and a very symbolic conflict of the greater struggles in the world.
Now, many in the United States, I'm a bit opposed to Nancy Pelosi's visits, primarily because it's just yet another escalation of tensions in a world of wash and cost conflict. What is your feeling? I mean, obviously, I'm sure Japan is pleased with Pelosi's visits, but again, the increased military drills and the potential for China to react in a more aggressive manner, that has to be a concern. And Pelosi surely understood this going into this.
So speaking strictly for myself, I am not opposed to Pelosi's visit for several reasons. First of all, the U.S. is losing its economic clout.
Right.
China is quickly becoming the number one trading partner of most countries around the world, including Latin American countries, which historically have been trading partners primarily with the United States. China is gaining the upper hand economically in several ways. It's not only in like toys and agriculture, but also in 5G technology, AI, rockets. It sent successfully a mission to the moon recently. And so China is really, a go-getter. It's not pleased with just being a developing state and just being a periphery to the United States forever. No, it's actually going out there and getting things done, and improving its economy. And this is, again, where international relations theorists have a basis for saying that the next phase of hegemony will be a divide between the U.S. retaining a role as a military hegemony and as a security guarantor for the world, and China becoming the economic hegemony and the economic center of gravity of the world. This has not happened yet for a reason that we can get into in another episode possibly. But returning to Pelosi's visit, because the U.S. has such a dependence on its military as a claim to its hegemony, it had to do this. It had to show that it's not afraid to engage. It's not afraid to show up for its allies, because Taiwan is a U.S. ally, and it's not afraid to ruffle feathers if it needs to. And I completely understand the sympathies of many Chinese in mainland China, thinking that this is some form of Western encroachment. It is encroachment. Let's not mix things up. America, in fact, has no business in this region.
Absolutely.
But yes, it does not. But for the sake of the world order to remain based on American military strength, it has had to do this. And I think it's absurd to just allow China to just dictate where foreign leaders can and cannot go, when Taiwan itself does not want to be part of China. Like, it's respecting Taiwan's right to self-determination at the end of the day, and Taiwan's right to host whoever it wants to, whenever it wants to. So for China to act this way, I don't think it's going to be a major problem. China is a lot more pragmatic. There's a lot more people making decisions in the Chinese Communist Party than in Russia, for example, where Putin and a very small group of people who are wealthy hold power. China knows that if it does escalate, there's no going back, because it will be war. The U.S. has signed security defense pacts with Japan. That's why Japan cannot have an offensive army, is because of its security pact with the United States. Taiwan also has a security understanding and is a client of the United States military-industrial complex. So in sum, yes, the United States has no business being in the region, but the fact is that the United States depends on being a military force globally to remain respected as the hegemon. And for better or for worse, the global liberal order, which affords a lot of people civil liberties, depends on this being the case.
Okay, so on a similar note, I want to go back to Israel. Again, recently since we've talked, it's been discovered that the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee has engaged in what many have called an intrusion upon our election system, funding a lot of the right-wingers that were engaged in the insurrection on January 6th. And I think this really brings into question the influence and the abuse of that influence that Israel has throughout the world. Can you would you say that Israel is a true ally in the sense of reciprocating, or is it not itself part of the upset throughout the Middle East?
I'm gonna give two devil's advocate talking points before I decimate them, just so I satisfy everyone in a fair way. First of all, everyone has an interest group lobbying for their interests, so it's not bad for AIPAC per se to be lobbying. Secondly, there's no such thing as a true ally. It's all based on mutual interests. Sometimes those interests overlap. Sometimes those interests happen to converge with overlapping ideologies, such as the case in the transatlantic relationship. Europe and the United States have more or less similar values of democracy, freedom, liberalism. However, Pakistan at one point was an ally of the United States during the war on terror, and Pakistan and the US do not really converge on ideology much. So it's just allyship is a matter of interest, right time, right place. Now, going back to what it's done, I'm not surprised at all that AIPAC has done this, because Israel can do basically whatever it wants and just gets a slap on the wrist. When the Saudi prince murdered Jamal Khashoggi, everyone was up in arms over this one American journalist. But when Israel shoots several Palestinian American journalists, it doesn't get nearly as much attention, because there's an establishment somehow whereby, as you know, media is controlled by large corporations, and if you pay enough if if you pay the right people the right sums and instruct them the right way, they can minimize news or not even cover it at all. Like there's a war going on right now again in Gaza, and I'm sure it's going to just get like a day or two of coverage and then move on to other things. It's not only the right that's guilty of this, by the way. There's many Democrats who are also guilty with complacency with what Israel has done.
No question.
There's a sense, yes, there's a sense that you kind of have to pay lip service to Zionism in order to have a viable political career. Even in pop culture, like I'm making an example. Your viewers might be shocked to know that I'm a huge Nicki Minaj fan. Like, I love Nicki Minaj. I think she's talented. She's sensational. Anyway, 10 years ago, she was a judge on American Idol. And I remember distinctively an Israeli singer auditioning on one of the episodes. And she was, like, fine. She wasn't particularly outstanding. She wasn't Kelly Clarkson. She wasn't Kate Hudson or whatever. Jennifer Hudson, or she wasn't that kind of talented. But when she stopped singing, Nicki Minaj was like, "Oh, I think you're talented. I think you're perfect. I think you're going to make it. I think you're sensational." I think she said it in that way. She said it that vehemently, that quickly. There is a PR game going on as well to cleanse Israel's image because people in the States are catching on to what it's doing. You have a lot of rappers calling it out in their songs. Of course, not big establishment rappers, because it's somehow expected that as soon as you criticize Israel, you're branded as anti-Semitic,
Yes.
and immediately your career is over. You're immediately canceled. That's the dark side of cancel culture. It's very hard to rebound from a defamatory, from what's perceived as a defamatory statement or what's perceived as a bigoted statement. I learned about anti-Semitism again when I was in high school. I didn't even know what it meant. What I did know growing before that point was images that I see on television of these soldiers going into people's houses, kicking them out, so someone can move in there who's whiter and who's like celebrating and so happy. And I'm like, what is this cruelty? What is going on? Basic property rights, man. Like the Torah does not come with a list of property rights for you. There's such a thing as a contract, such a thing as a lease of land, so on and so forth. So for sure, there's a multi-layered effort to maintain the status quo in Israel and not alleviate things for the better. But I think that's coming to an end soon.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I mean, as you say, Israel has this ability to engage in activities mostly throughout the world where it has almost this blanket immunity. In my monologue, I talked about espionage and the espionage that Israel has committed against the United States, which has gone, again, mostly unpunished. A lot of this has
Military
been done through AIPAC, which is operated out almost as a foreign agent that these charges of anti-Semitism have been lodged against anyone that criticizes either AIPAC or Israel. It's become a political weapon.
It really has. It's a very lazy weapon, really, because Jon Stewart, as you know, also criticized Israel. They couldn't use anti-Semitism against him, so they just called him a self-hating Jew. Like, come on, is it always psychological that people want to protect basic property rights of brown people abroad? It's absurd. And I remember I was in Washington over 10 years ago, doing a semester abroad at American University. And there I was surprised to find a student-led organization called Christians United for Israel. I was like, what? Christians United? Do you know that sometimes Zionist fanatics spray paint Hebrew on churches in Palestine to like demarcate that this is no longer Christian territory, it's now Jewish territory, blah, 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 blah. Like, their fundamentalism does not only affect Muslims, it also pretty much affects Christians. And let's not forget that it's a Palestinian Arab who has custody of one of the oldest churches in Christianity, the Patriarch of the Palestinian territories. And so Christians are also a victim of this. I just wanted to point that out to your viewers because such organizations really baffled me, especially the evangelists and whatever.
Well, I mean, they have an entirely more bizarre reasons for Israel. I mean,
Yes.
their whole
Yeah.
doctrine is once Israel is destroyed, then their savior will come back and rapture them up. Um, Now, I noticed you've been very careful about how you talk about the Israelis and Palestinians. Would you not?
Hmm.
I would almost call that a form of ethnic cleansing. Certainly, it's an apartheid
Yes.
state.
Yes. Certainly
Um,
so. You have we have to distinguish between what is like de facto Israel and what are the Palestinian territories, which are the West Bank and Gaza. Even in so if you look at a map of the West Bank, it's not one coherent state. It looks like Greece, which is a collection of islands, except instead of the ocean, it's settlements. So it's a bunch of settlements between different patches of Arab land. And because of the settlements, you have to set up security infrastructure. And this means that the local population, the native population, has to pass through dozens of checkpoints to get from point A to point B. Like it could really be a short distance, but the checkpoints take forever. They're designed to take forever, not only because of the safety measures, but also as also to depress the local population into not resisting. But they will never stop resisting because they like once you know that you're being oppressed
right.
and it's affecting you and your loved ones, and there's very bleak prospects for you to improve your life or even to leave the country because your passport's also at the mercy. Like there's no airports in the West Bank and Gaza. You have to go to Israel to travel and to and from anywhere. So it's really you're really at the mercy of that state that's occupied you. They also impose sometimes their currency on you. They also withdraw tax revenue because it's all been like they've all been engulfed into the same economy somehow. It's very overreaching and very cruel. Um, and the fact that this is supported by a religion is absurd because I'm sure that all religions, if you talk to their founders, they would be very vehemently against what's going on. Especially given the Jewish history of struggle and strife and so on. So there's that to consider. And I just want to point out that the way the right wing plays into this, as you know, if there's any anti-Semitism going on here, it's from the right. The
Oh,
left is not known
absolutely.
for being anti-Semitic at all. So what happens? A theory I've heard is that it's in the interest of the right wing to have such a thing as Israel because they don't want Jews in the U.S. and in Europe. They'd rather, if they're going to exist, let them exist in their homeland. We don't want them around here. So that's one of the arguments that I perceive from the right as to why they support it. And of course, because there's people with no integrity who will just say they're with anything if you give them the right amounts of money.
Now, it really, when we're talking about the division of land, as you just
Mm.
mentioned, Israel, at least as we know it today, did not exist until World War II. Um, and a lot of the Middle East was sort of torn apart in the aftermath of, of the Holocaust. How much of that kind of is residual in terms of the relationship between Israel and the Middle East?
Uh, so just to recap, Israel was created in 1950 through a UN resolution. It wasn't there before 1950. So and also the Holocaust. I don't know how much it affected the Middle East per se. I do know that during the difficulties, the Middle East did um, take in a lot of people escaping persecution, Jews
Absolutely.
escaping persecution, as we had before during the Spanish Inquisition. So we're no strangers to hosting those fleeing persecution. Um, the that the war in Europe caused the Holocaust, and then the war in Europe also caused the Middle East to be divided. It's really Europe's mess. Like, they caused this. They carved up the Ottoman Empire. They gave what was Palestine to to Zionists, essentially,
Yes.
without getting consent from the local population. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Any American would be against this happening to them. If I go to Texas and I say, "Oh, well, sorry, Dallas, I made an agreement with Mexico that they're going to get the entire city. We didn't ask you. It's just going to happen. And if you say anything, we'll call you racist against Latinos. And also, we're armed to the teeth from European sympathizers and German guilt, essentially. So there's not much you can do. I bet you every single right winger listening to this would just be aching to resist with armed violence. So I don't want to hear this whole thing about, oh, why are they resisting with armed violence? You would do the same thing. In America, there's gunshots for the stupidest reasons.
Oh, yeah.
So a noble reason like reclaiming your land or protecting your land, I think is more worthy of using guns, especially in retaliation, than just having some guy being racist shooting up a black church. Give me a break.
And Israel would it be fair to say that it's in a theocratic nation more than it is a democracy?
It's not only theocratic, it's also ethnically hierarchical, because you have several. I didn't know this until I looked it up. Like, there's several. Jewish people have a way of categorizing each other as Ashkenazi Jews, there's Sephardic Jews, so on and so forth. There's a hierarchy in that's embedded into society. It's almost like a caste system, but not exactly allocating who does what in society, but there's like a class, like, oh, X type of Jews are classier than X or Y type of Jews,
Right.
or whatever. It is a theocracy, yes, certainly so, because it bases its existence on being the quote-unquote Jewish state, which means that it doesn't afford the same democratic capacities to residents of other faiths, not only Muslims, but also Druze. Druze are rarely talked about as being part of Israeli society, but Druze is a very rare religion, which I belong to, that is observed by many people in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine, and Israel as well. They recently received bad news when Israel passed the Jewish state law, which essentially made them kind of second-class citizens, even though they'd been the Druze in Israel, even though they'd been quite loyal to the Zionist entity. Yes, it is a theocracy. To go back to what you were asking, it certainly is a theocracy. And if you ask people, like, once you argue with some of the hardliners, once you like dismantle their arguments of being like a back and forth that we initiated as Arabs, you get to the point where they will say, okay, well, this land was promised to us by God, which is not an argument. That's not an
No,
argument.
not
And
at all.
so, and this is why Ben Shapiro, I think, Ben Shapiro is just so, anyway, that's why Ben,
He's actually here if
like,
you want to talk to him.
is he?
Yeah, he's going through puberty. Finally.
Ben Shapiro is really such a fierce lesbian that the lesbian community should be quite proud of. But anyway, yes, that's why he has to base it somehow on religion, because you can go through the rational, factual arguments as to why this is unfair. And if you look at, there was recently a huge scandal that was widely covered when the settler just tried to come up and, take this person's house. And she was like, but this is not your house, Jeff. And he's from New York. He's like a Jew from New York. He's like, okay, but everyone's doing it, so it's not my fault. Everyone's doing it, and God said it's mine, so everyone's doing it. And she was like, but this is not your house. This is, in fact, not your house. God may have promised you the land, but I built this house myself, and I don't frankly care if God promised you the land. My God promised me this land. Like, what a stupid argument to make. I understand that there's a lot of strife and there's a lot of frustration within the Jewish community because of the Holocaust, but we did not cause the Holocaust. If you do want a patch of land that's just for you, take it in Germany. Take it to the people who did it to you. Don't take it to us. And Germany has been I just so we're clear, I have many German friends. I love my German friends, but Germany as a state has been very uncooperative and very unhelpful in resolving the situation because it basically bans any kind of advocacy that is Palestinian inside Germany. It's just so scared of offending Israel in any slightest way. It's very guilt-stricken, and it should be. But the result of this being guilt-stricken is that I'm sure in 20 years' time, when this is even more of a scandal, Germany will become guilt-stricken about the Palestinians because what's happening now, it may not be as immediate as the Holocaust, but it's certainly ranking up in the numbers and getting there. Um, certain if misery could be measurable, certainly so, and not only in misery but also in body count. So Germany is also something that has to be called out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you say too, I mean, a lot of this is based on a religious argument, and this we're much like Germany, maybe not to the same degree, but here in the United States, the boycott and divestment,
Yes,
is
movement.
almost illegal in certain contexts. Some states have tried to pass laws banning it. Um,
Yep.
Teachers have been
So much for
fired
free
for.
speech.
Oh, go
Yeah,
ahead.
so much for free speech. Yeah, I mean, if you look at if you look at the values on the right, some of them are quite noble. They're fiercely for freedom of expression, fiercely for freedom of speech. But some of their leaders just have no integrity, and they will allow the passage of laws which infringe explicitly on freedom of speech and expression, such as the right to boycott. Um, uh, there was a case where this nurse had to sign before she started work. She had to sign a document that recognizes Israel in some way, and she did not want to do that, and she could not get the job afterward. People really need to separate Judaism from Zionism. I think that if people think that they're banning anti-Semitism by doing this, Arabs are Semitic people. We're just as Semitic as Jews, and so Israel is anti-Semitic towards us. And George Bush was anti-Semitic because of Iraq, you could say.
Yeah,
Everyone who's
Islamophobic.
racist towards Arabs is anti-Semitic by the same merit that the Nazis were towards the Jews. So people really need to get their semantics in order as well. And certainly when it comes to boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, something has to be done. Something has to be done. Like, okay, you don't want armed resistance? Fine. Well, we're going to have to get their attention and make them change economically. Oh, we can't do that. Well, what do we do? And what do we do? And frankly, you don't get to decide what we do. We will do what we do. And so long as you don't punish the aggressor, you give us no choice.
Right,
That's the
and
issue here.
what America needs to do is I mean, America could resolve this or certainly lead to a resolution by simply saying, we're going to cut off foreign assistance to Israel until, this is resolved, until you stop at the very least oppressing the Palestinian people. But
There's
the
more that it
government
can
won't do
do.
that.
There's more that it can do. The dynamics have changed in the region because Israel is normalized with many Arab states. It doesn't need American aid as much as it used to economically, because it's trading now with Dubai and etc. So it's kind of weaning off the states. But what the United States could do is pressure Israel to reform politically, and it could allow the fair reporting of what happens there. And it could, if it really seeks to democratize and liberalize the Middle East, that has to be its starting point, not anything else. Because until that is resolved, the Arabs will remain skeptical of any American initiative in the region. Even to this day in Lebanon, you have the American ambassador there. Anything that she proposes is regarded by a lot of people who are pro-Iran as something that would benefit Israel. And the danger is that, okay, if these American plans were enacted in Lebanon, namely the disarmament of Hezbollah and other non-desirables that Israel and the United States see as that, there's no guarantee that Israel will not conquer Lebanon, that it will not conquer Syria. because Israel does occupy a part of Syria called the Golan Heights that Dick Cheney's oil company has a huge part in promoting and in maintaining. And it's also during the Lebanese Civil War in the 80s, it conquered almost half the country as a quote unquote buffer zone. So until the United States visibly holds Israel's hands off, cutting it off economically may not be the best way forward. Because Israel is pretty, like, they have industries, they're pretty well off. We can argue about the reasons for those, but the fact is that they're pretty well off. They don't need military assistance. They, of course, no one would say no to extra money, but they don't need it to say. So the states, any measure has to not only be legislative at the government level, but also at the level of people and news and voting. It really has to be an issue that is brought up at elections. It shouldn't just be, but of course, the problem is that everyone has problems. All the regions of the world have problems and disputes. What makes our issue more important than others? Here's one thing that makes it at least as important as Ukraine, for example, is the fact that resolving this one issue will have resolved almost 50% of disputes in the Middle East is just by this issue. And so if any American really wants war to stop in the Middle East and wants to stop American involvement in the Middle East, because remember, if there's no wars to partake in, then that's a lot of money saved for the Pentagon that could be used towards education, towards other more pressing issues in the United States itself. If any American wants to see proper reform in how military-industrial complex is spending and how America conducts itself abroad, Israel is where you start, I think.
Yes. And that's exactly one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you back to finish that interview, because I think it's important for my viewers and listeners to understand that it's not anti-Semitism to objectively criticize Israel. And what you just said, too, matters for U.S. national security.
National security for its people. Yeah. I mean, what is security anyway? Security is not just about protecting you from guns. It's also about protecting your health and making sure that you have the tools to go out and work and sustain yourself. That is what security is. It's about protecting one's life. Not only freedom from, but freedom to. Not only protection from, but protection to. Yeah.
Yeah. And
my phone's going to die.
No. Well, not again. Well, I know that you've got limited time, so I want to let you go, but thank you so much for coming back to finish this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
It really is important.
Cheers some more.
And we'll definitely have you back. So thank you again, and you have a great week.
Thank you. You too.
And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this extra long episode of Coup Save America. Please join us next Tuesday at 2 o'clock Pacific Standard Time for another episode. And hopefully I will shed this yellow-orange tint that I have for some reason. High definition, I guess. Thanks again. We'll see you next week. This has been Coup Save America. I'm Sean St. Hart.